Most studies examining gender differences in criminal justice systems often focus on sentencing outcomes, often tying men's criminal culpability with heavier prison sentences. Existing studies mostly focus on the judge's decisions, which are founded on offense level and a defendant's criminal history. The studies fall into the bias of sentencing being influenced by prosecutors' capacious charging and bargaining discretion. The studies focusing purely on sentencing outcomes have uncovered a 30% unexplained gender gap in sentencing length, with other studies outlining smaller disparities of around 10% in sentencing outcomes. The problem with these studies is that they ignore a series of discretionary decisions that influence sentencing outcomes. The gender gaps in criminal sentencing are influenced by disparities in the earlier stages of a case, especially fact-finding. Most countries around the world have some form of negotiated justice, with prosecutors holding most of the chips. The studies that find gender disparities in plea bargaining processes often focus on certain bargaining outcomes, such as binary measures on whether charges were dropped, ignoring the contents of fact-finding outcomes that massively influence the bargaining process. Ignoring disparities in a prosecutor's choice of charges renders the resultant charge bargaining outcomes meaningless. The point being, plea bargaining is not an isolated process. Federal sentencing is guided by two legal frameworks. The first is sentencing range specification for each crime, the range being 0 to 20 years. The second framework contains narrower ranges implemented in 1987 to deal with sentencing disparities, including those related to gender. Judges determine the level of an offense based on criminal conviction and sentencing facts, with most judges' findings at around 92% differing from the outcomes of the plea bargaining process. For instance, if the police tend to treat men more harshly than they do women during arrests, which they do, then it is likely to overestimate men's culpability in criminal activity compared to women's. Holding all factors constant, reported crimes with female offenders are significantly less likely to result in arrests, showing police leniency towards women. Men are more likely to commit crimes involving a great degree of force, but there are minimal gender differences in drug, property, and minor offense-related crimes. Minor offense-related crimes include pickpocketing and vehicle theft. The distortion of facts in the fact-finding stage accounts for up to 20% of unexplained gender differences in sentencing outcomes favoring women. Drug quantity and type influence the eligibility for mandatory minimums, accounting for approximately 30% of gender disparities in post-arrest gaps. Substantial disparities are recorded in the sentencing stage of drug-related crimes. The safety valve loophole built into drug mandatory minimum statutes explains up to 9% of gender disparities in sentencing-related outcomes. Eligibility for the safety valve is based on a number of case-related components, including lack of obstruction during arrest, lacking an aggravating role, certain case features, and criminal history. Taking eligibility into consideration, women are way more likely to receive safety valve reductions compared to men. Women are more likely to cooperate with prosecutors and other court actors than men are. Women are more likely to receive downward departures for cooperation at around 20% compared to 17% for men. Women also have higher guilty plea rates at around 97.5% compared to 96.2% for men. In charges and conviction-related scales, women receive larger reductions in plea bargaining, more favorable fact-finding outcomes, and better factual stipulations. Women being more risk-averse as part of their personality justifies why prosecutors could be more lenient. In a similar breadth, men's risk-taking and disagreeable behaviors lead to heavier sentences. In group offenses, women are more likely to be perceived as minor players, perhaps accessories to their male romantic partners. Prosecutors, judges, and other court actors are more likely to view women as less dangerous, less morally culpable, and more useful resources in gathering testimonies. Prosecutors, judges, and other court actors perceive men as more dangerous than women, buying into the whole societal presentation of the genders, thereby justifying handing heavier sentences to men. In cases involving couples, almost always, women are perceived and presented as innocent followers who were manipulated by their romantic partners. The girlfriend theory is supported by the fact that multi-defendant cases show the largest gender disparities in sentencing outcomes and differences in sentencing adjustments based on an individual's role in the offense. The gender gap in multi-defendant cases is 66%, compared to 51% in single-defendant cases. 14% of unexplained sentencing-related gender gaps in non-drug cases and 20% in drug cases is explained by role adjustments. Female defendants are much more likely to have primary custody of their children compared to male defendants, with the resultant age and number of dependents serving as a mitigation factor in sentencing women, but not men. While women complain of the burden of childcare, when childcare serves their interests, then they have no problem making the most of it. Mentioning childcare in cases involving female defendants reduces judges' likelihood of recommending prison time, but mentioning financial support does not. As a matter of fact, child support still accumulates even if the father is incarcerated, unless they can afford legal counsel to halt the order on the basis of incapacitation or inability to provide for the child due to incarceration. Bearing in mind that women, through abortion and safe haven laws, are allowed to opt out of parenting, but men cannot opt out irrespective of their circumstances. Even in instances of statutory rape, the male victims are still likely to be required to pay child support. Anyway, the child care theory explaining sentencing disparities is evidenced by the fact that up to 2% of gendered sentencing gap is explained by disproportionate invoking of the family hardship departure sentencing guidelines. In other words, women abandoning the family is way more detrimental than men. The same women who are legally allowed to opt out of parenting and are way more likely to disproportionately abuse their biological children and children under their care. Women receive hardship-related reductions at rates 3 times higher than men who are not legally allowed to opt out of parenting. Children increase sentencing severity for single men, while they have no influence in the case of married men. The idea that women are more affected by life circumstances, including poverty, abuse, addiction, and mental illness, explains the ease of court actors to be lenient towards women. The presentation of women as greater victims of life circumstances diminishes their moral and legal culpability, thereby raising the likelihood of leniency. Based on the assumption that women are less likely to commit crime, those who actually commit crime are perceived to be at the tail end of the life-related outcomes. Prisoner studies show more self-reported mental illness and histories of abuse in women compared to men. The gender gap is greater in the Black community at 74% compared to 51% in the non-Black community. Racial disparities among men favor whites, partly due to the Black male effect that explains more harshness towards Black men, with the rates being insignificant among women.